You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Would you pay to choose the sex of your unborn baby? Well, it's emerged some British couples are doing just that. A British-trained doctor called Jeffrey Steinberg, and who works in the US, says he currently helps around 40 British couples a year choose the sex of their child, so-called family balancing. In an interview with a British newspaper, Dr. Steinberg revealed he has assisted 400 British women since he began offering the service a few years ago. The service is called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, PGD. And in Europe, PGD is legal in cases where a male or female embryo has a 50% chance of carrying a genetic disease such as haemophilia, and then PGD is used to select a female egg rather than a male one. The process of PGD for choosing the sex of a child is illegal in the UK under the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act in 1990. Joining me in the studio is Alan Thornhill, a leading specialist in PGD and works at the Bridge Clinic in London. Stephen Wilkinson is the Professor of Bioethics at Keele University and author of a book called Choosing Tomorrow's Children. And Anthony Ozimic is from the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children. And on the telephone from New York, Dr. Peter Sarosi, who's on the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology and works at the Manhattan Fertility Clinic. So my question, first of all, is it right for couples to use science to choose the sex of their baby? Anthony Ozimic.
Well, really, we would describe this as, in fact, a form of eugenics in which parents decide that their children of one sex or another are, in fact, unworthy to be part of their family. And really, the terms sex selection and family balancing hide this practice's unethical reality. I mean, sex selection is an unworthy motive for human parenting. Children are gifts to be accepted unconditionally, not products to be selected and subject to quality control. And in particular, PGD involves the creation of many embryos which are then killed. As Dr. Steinberg said, 8 or 9 will be successfully fertilized. We will be left with just 1 or 2 of the gender we want to implant. Now, each one of those embryos was an member of the human family with an equal right to life. So we have a lethal form of eugenics being allowed and being extended in this sort of no questions asked practice being offered by Dr. Steinberg.
I'd like to ask you now, Alan Thornhill.
I think it's right for couples to use science to choose the sex of their baby, but it's the intention for which they're choosing the sex. So I think you already said in your introduction that it was acceptable in this country and many other countries to choose the sex of the baby for medical reasons. It becomes a different question when it's for non-medical reasons, and clearly the law is clear in this country and a number of other countries saying it's illegal to do so for non-medical reasons. It's not for me to say whether it's right or wrong, but certainly science has not exactly been misused in this circumstance. It's just been used for a purpose other than which it was designed.
Dr. Peter Sarosi.
Well, I don't agree with the opinion of the couples not being able to choose the gender of the child. I think that the science is available to us, and we should not be the ones to decide in a free society as to what the parents would desire to have. If its science is available and it's doable readily, and they should have their choices.
OK, well, the question comes to you then, please, Stephen Wilkinson.
Thank you. I think my take on this is quite pragmatic in the sense we need to look at 3 issues, I think, in relation to sex selection. First of all, what are the motives and reasons for which people do it? And to avoid sex-linked disorders has already been mentioned as one good reason. Seems to me we could perhaps push it a little bit further, and there may be some cases where for reasons of family balancing, if gender is really, really important to a particular family, that could be a permissible reason. But there are also some bad reasons, such as sexism and so on. We also need to look at the means that are being used to achieve sex selection, and I think clearly many people are much more comfortable with a mode of sex selection that takes place very early in the reproductive process. So, for instance, if we could effectively choose between different sperm, many people would think that was an acceptable method. Early embryos is a more debatable point, but many people think that it is permissible to intervene at that stage, and that's not tantamount to murder, if you like. Finally, we need to look at the sort of question of whether anybody's harmed by this. So is the child created harmed, or will there be significant social problems such as population sex imbalance? And I think if the answer to all those questions can be no, which it can be in some cases, then sex selection could well be permissible in those cases, and we should allow it. So I don't think it's categorically wrong, nor do I think it's categorically right. I think we've got to look at the context and look at people's reasons and what the effects would be of doing it.
Well, Alan Thornhill, what is PGD? Can you explain to us, in fact, what couples are actually going through?
Very simply, this PGD we're talking about now is a process by which embryos are created outside of the body, and then a single cell or a couple of cells are taken from the embryo. Hopefully that does no damage to the embryo. They're diagnosed, in this case, for the gender, for male or female, and the embryo, meanwhile, is growing in culture, and the embryo of the desired sex is then transplanted into the uterus in the hope of initiating a pregnancy.
Dr. Peter Sarosi, could you give us a few examples of the sort of people that are coming to your clinic and the sort of decisions they're making and choices they're making?
Yeah, before I do that, I just want to add one thing to Dr. Thornhill's description of the PGD. That is the kind of PGD that we did a few years back. Today, at least we at our center, we do PGD on a blastocyst, which is a day 5 developed embryo, in which we check all 23 pairs of chromosomes, which is quite important in this discussion. So actually, we're not just selecting for gender, we're selecting for normal chromosome embryo, and therefore be able to make the success much higher and cut down on possible miscarriages later on. So that's one point that I just wanted to interject in here after Dr. Thornhill's description of PGD. And in answer to your question, you asked what kind of patients come to our clinic?
Well, what situations do they present to you when they come to your clinic in terms of the so-called family balancing?
Well, almost exclusively all of them come for family balancing, like you said. Usually they have 2 or 3 children of the same gender already at home, and they're very desirous of having the opposite gender just to complete their family.
But who determines the completion of the family? What's the idea of the complete family? Where does that come from?
They would like genders of the children of both different genders for children.
Do you ask them for a reason why?
As to why they would desire that? No, that is not for me. That's their desire. I'm here to try to help them achieve their desire.
Anthony Ozimic.
Well, firstly, just because we can do something scientifically doesn't mean that we should do something scientifically, and doctors should not be businessmen doing whatever their patients want for large sum of money. There's no moral right to choose the sex of one's child or indeed any other characteristic such as no disabilities or particularly desirable personality traits that has recently been proposed by Professor Savulescu in Oxford. Public acceptance of a practice, if there are large people coming to the clinic in New York, or whatever public opinion may say, simply doesn't make it ethical. I mean, at one time people accepted things like the slave trade or child labour just because it may be popular among some people or many people doesn't make it ethically acceptable. I suggest that Dr. Sarosi and Dr. Steinberg look at the purposes of medicine, which is not to be social engineers or businessmen, but is to serve the health of their patients. And these patients do not have health conditions requiring any form of assisted fertility treatment. And what he's doing is wrong, exposing women to the risks of IVF, and there is no medical reason for doing that.
Would you like to respond, Dr. Sarosi?
Well, obviously I disagree with the opinion, but that is your opinion.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. And today we're asking, is it right for couples to use science to choose the sex of their baby? Joining me in the studio is Dr. Alan Thornhill, a leading specialist in pre-implantation genetics and clinical embryology, PGD. Alan also works at the Bridge Centre in London. Stephen Wilkinson is a professor of bioethics at Keele University and author of a book called Choosing Tomorrow's Children. And Anthony Ozimic is from the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children. Joining us on the telephone from New York is Dr. Peter Sarosi, who is on the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology and works at the Manhattan Fertility Clinic. Dr. Thornhill, you're a leading specialist in PGD and work at a fertility clinic in the UK. I mean, is this family balancing? Are we using the technology in the right way?
I just want to pick up on these. I think this field is beset by terms that people don't fully understand and fully explain. So we use the term PGD, and in most of Europe, it's considered only PGD when it's for strict medical indications. So I'm not disagreeing with Dr. Sarosi, and I know the American community use it fairly interchangeably. But I think it's more helpful when we say there's one type for known inherited disorders, there's another type for screening out genetic abnormalities, as Dr. Sarosi described, looking at all the chromosomes, and then there's this intention of screening for gender for a particular purpose. And I think it's more helpful when you know what a couple has come for, because generally speaking, if a couple comes for sex selection, you're throwing in the chromosome screen at the same time. That's not really the purpose they came for. And I'm not judging that. I'm just saying that's an important distinction. I think another important distinction is between family balancing, and I think Stephen picked up on it as well, and producing a single heir, if you like, a male heir, which most people seem to have a problem with. And I think they are quite distinct. You're using the same methodology, but for quite different intentions. And I've met quite a few families with children of one particular gender who are almost obsessed, I think that's probably the right word, in getting another child that's of a different gender. One can't really try and understand their particular motives. I don't want to. That's their choice. It's their family. They choose the size of their family, when they have a family, what schools the children go to, what they eat, who provides the healthcare, and yet they can't choose this last bastion of choice for the child. And I find that slightly unusual.
Stephen Wilkinson.
Yes, I mean, I think if you look on the web, you can see a lot of interesting narratives from people who want selection. Many of them are women who want daughters, for instance, and some of them, many of them, I think, are in a family balancing situation. They've got lots of sons, and the kind of things they say there are that they'd really, it's tremendously important to them to have the experience of bonding with a daughter, and we might not like that. We might say, well, look, you should just get over it and deal with living with lots of boys. But I think as a matter of sort of psychological fact for those people, it is very, very important to them. And that doesn't, of course, guarantee that we should do it. We don't have to do everything that people want. Clearly, that's not a defensible position. But the question we do have to ask is, given that it's very important to these people, is there a sufficiently strong sort of ethical reason to stop them from doing it? And I think, given the caveats I mentioned earlier, we could construct a situation in which that was an acceptable form of sex selection.
I think it's really interesting in that I am actually one of 4 daughters, and I've, throughout my life, had comments such as, your poor father, were your parents trying for a boy? Wasn't your mum disappointed with another girl? And when my mum had her 4th daughter, the most hurtful comments she received were, aren't you disappointed? And she wasn't disappointed. She wanted a healthy baby. But I asked her, I said, would you have chosen the sex of your baby? And she said yes. But when I said, would you have opted to use science or PGD in a specific way to ensure the sex of your baby, she said no. So we've got the question is, are we allowing science to interfere too much with what people want? Is it become too available? Dr. Thornhill?
I think Stephen picked up on this earlier. He said if there was a more palatable method like selecting sperm, which in fact there is, there are questions over its safety. Passing sperm through a flow cytometer, staining it first, and then producing children at the end skews the sex ratio in a particular way, but not 100%. So PGD is much closer to 100%. That's why people use that method. There's never been any really good evidence for it, but it seems plausible that there may be a method for selecting sperm based on their swimming ability. The idea being that Y-bearing sperm that would produce males could swim in a different way or have different properties from the other sperm. If you could select those, then it'd be, it's almost terribly non-invasive way of directing things in the direction you wanted in terms of gender. I'd like to even raise the idea that if perhaps there were particular dietary supplements or something you could do at home, over the counter, which, your mother or even a friend of mine who said...
My dad had black coffee and bananas, apparently. Did nothing.
Okay, but there's many, homespun remedies that clearly don't work. But if one were to exist and the medical fraternity were not required anymore, maybe we'd be only talking about intention rather than method. And then would we really say to people, you can't do this because we don't like the fact that you want to have a child of a particular gender?
I think
Stephen Wilkinson.
That's right. I think the and this is a desire that people have had that predates this science by a long, long way. There's a very long history of sort of folk attempts to influence the gender of your child, dietary ones, sexual positions, and so on. There's a great sort of folk history of this. So I don't think it's the desire isn't generated by the science. It's the other way around. I'd also like to say, actually, going back to your point about family balancing, that I think actually family balancing is a slightly unfortunate term, because the suggestion mustn't be that a family is unbalanced. The suggestion is, I think, perhaps mixed family would be better or something like that, because it's not these people are not claiming that everybody ought to have a mixed family. The claim is that they'd very much like to experience having a child of the gender that they don't presently have. So it's just a personal choice rather than trying to say that families are unbalanced if they're like yours or male.
Anthony Ozimic, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think we're hearing a certain amount of equivocation and moral relativism. It doesn't matter what the technique is, whether it's sperm sorting or it's PGD or some other technique. We're still talking about a discrimination against the undesired gender. We're still applying social control to human procreation, to human parenting. That's really an unworthy motive, that children should be accepted into a family regardless of their sex. And we really need to be focusing on what is the purpose of medicine. Purpose of medicine is not to do what patients want doctors to do. It's for the doctors to make give a judgment as to what is ethical and what is necessary to improve the health of their patients. And the women going to the clinic in New York do not have health problems, and therefore they should not be offered this technique.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare, and I'm asking if it's right for couples to use science to choose the sex of their baby. Joining me in the studio is Alan Thornhill, a leading specialist in PGD, Stephen Wilkinson, Professor of Bioethics at Keele University, Anthony Ozimic from the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, and on the telephone from New York, Dr. Peter Sarosi, who's on the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology and works at the Manhattan Fertility Clinic. Dr. Sarosi, how many patients do you see a month?
International patients or just patients in general, you're asking?
International patients.
International. We do international. We see international patients probably about 4 or 5 a month.
And where are they from?
I would say 50% are from the UK, the rest of it from the rest of Europe, and some are from Africa.
Would you say the majority of those patients choose a girl or a boy?
I have not done statistics over the last 5 or so years that we've been offering this. I would say it's probably even, pretty much even, depending on what their needs are.
Anthony Ozimic, though, suggested that these people that come to see you are not unwell and that they're choosing to undergo a procedure when they're healthy, and that's ethically wrong.
Well, it's just that I totally disagree with Anthony Ozimic. That's his opinion. He's entitled to it. I believe that it's not a procedure that is dangerous to them, and it's a procedure that is explained and they're fully, freely and willingly undergo because of their desires.
Can I ask, once you've got the embryos that you need, what is done with those embryos that are discarded?
What is done with the embryos that's discarded?
Yeah.
The embryos are, you just mentioned, the embryos are discarded.
Dr. Alan Thornhill.
I'm not making a judgment. I just want to introduce some more facts so that there's a better perspective here. We're focusing on embryos that are selected or deselected for sex selection. The same process you're talking about, discarded embryos, is true for any IVF-generated embryo. So there could be a couple who have a very good reason to come for IVF, many of their embryos will likely be discarded as well after a period of time, because not everybody wants to or is even allowed to by law keep their embryos for eternity. That's the reality of the law. So I understand people's point of view when they say, I don't like the idea of embryos being discarded, but unfortunately, as soon as you bring IVF into the process, that's one of the inevitable consequences of it.
But there is an argument, though, that there's IVF for parents who can't conceive and have had difficulties conceiving, and that therefore science and IVF should be there to help them. But this is a process which is just being used for sex selection, and that's where
the intention is different.
Is.
And I said earlier that for me, it wasn't about methodology, it was about intention. And then we kind of came back to methodology again. I'm saying if there were a method that didn't involve embryos at all, I still think some people would have a problem with it. And yet I'm saying there's no embryos involved. Who's it harming? It's like, there's some sort of control that's required over people's intentions.
Yeah,
Stephen Wilkinson.
I think that's right, yes. That's the very interesting thing about this issue, is that even if you do take the embryo out of the equation, which you arguably can do or would be able to in due course, that the moral issues still remain. A couple of things that have been said I think are worth picking up on. One is about the sort of proper function of medicine and healthcare practitioners. And whilst it's true to say that sex selection for reasons of choice is not on its own about treating disease, there are parts of the healthcare professions which do go beyond treating disease, and so something like elective cosmetic surgery would be an example. So it doesn't follow from the fact that it's not a core function of medicine that it's wrong, and I obviously don't want to push that parallel too far, but I think it's not necessarily the case that just because a doctor isn't curing disease, he or she ought not to do it. I think that's just an invalid argument. Secondly, it's probably worth mentioning on the sort of population sex imbalance thing, which does worry some people, and there are apparently parts of China and India where there's really significant gender imbalance, up to 17% in favour of males, so I've read. When the HFEA, that's the UK regulatory body for this area of work, last gathered evidence on this some years ago, they came to the conclusion that in Western Europe as a whole, if sex selection were permitted, there would be broadly equal selection both ways, possibly with a slight preference for girls. That's just based on their report. But I don't think in the UK, possibly not in Western Europe, but the whole, there would be a significant sort of imbalance problem because the preferences are cutting both ways in equal measure.
So what sort of negative impacts is this proportion of men in the world over women going to have on society?
Well, that's why one crucial issue, if we were deciding whether to allow sex selection in any given situation, is what are the effects going to be on the population. I've just said that in the UK it's very unlikely to make any difference. Also, we have to bear in mind not many people would want to do this either, given the cost and difficulty. So it's unlikely to be a problem in our situation. Also, there are probably regulatory fixes that one could come up with as well for dealing with this. So, for instance, you could license clinics to offer only roughly equal amounts of male and female sex selection, so the output of any given clinic was broadly equal. So I think the population imbalance, if it were going to happen, it would be a problem for sure. I think it's something we should take into account. But we can probably be fairly content that it would not happen if this practice were permitted here. I mean, if your concern with sex selection is about the imbalance in the population, which I suspect it isn't in most cases, but if that is your concern, there are ways of reducing the impact or keeping the impact of that to close to zero.
Another way of doing that would also be to suggest that you had to provide your embryos, donate your unwanted embryos, which would, instantly balance, because all of the embryos created would be used. So you get away from the embryos being discarded. You'd be helping more couples, and you'd be having both genders being used. So there's ways around this in regulation. I don't think they're going to happen, but
yeah.
Well, really, what we're hearing proposed is an institutionalised discrimination. And on this basis, we can't really object to people from China and India who only want to have boys. And Dr. Steinberg admitted that clients from some countries were almost exclusively interested in boys. Demand from China was 98% for boys, he said, while from India it was 97%. So really, we have no ethical difference here between sex selection by embryo screening and sex selection by abortion or infanticide. We have a sort of form of population control, regardless of the issue of gender imbalance in the population. It is a form of population control in which people are allowed to say, no, we only want boys, we don't want girls. That's unethical, whatever the technique is.
We are nearing the end of our discussion. So, Dr. Peter Sarosi, a final word from you, really.
Yeah, I just would like to pick up on something that was mentioned all throughout this discussion, is the medical need that doctors should perform medicine to help their patients get better. And if you take into account that quite a few of these women who would like to so-called balance their families or equalize their children gender-wise, they may have, and very well do have, a mental problem, a psychological disease, so to speak, which we would need to help to correct. And we can correct it by offering them and trying to help them achieve the gender of their desire. So this somewhere and somehow also adds into their mental health.
A final word from you then, Stephen Wilkinson.
Just picking up on the claim that was made that this is necessarily discriminatory. I mean, I think, as I said earlier, I think the motives of the parents are really important, and they may or may not be discriminatory depending on the reasons why they want to do it. I mean, if somebody wanted to have boys because they thought boys were better than girls, I think that's sexist and morally problematic. If they've already got 3 boys and they really value the experience of having a girl, I don't see that being any sort of any negative view about boys that they're expressing there. They just want the diversity and the new experience. So let's not just assume that people are being discriminatory when they prefer one sex to another in all cases.
Dr. Alan Thornhill.
I feel like we've jumped from individual choice, which I would have thought that's what our society and medicine today is trying to help people with, to social control. And either, I didn't mention social control. I just said people should have choice. And, I think a person in their own home, if they could have that choice, should not be controlled. And if it requires some medical intervention at the moment, as long as it's not taking resources away from somebody who needs it more, then I think it should be allowed.
Anthony Ozimic.
Just pick up on a point by Dr. Sarosi saying that there are no risks involved in this technique. Well, the risk of ovarian hyperstimulation is very well known in this field, and it's unethical for the doctor to deny that there are no risks involved in this technique. So again, I think he needs to go back and review the purposes of medicine and review the ethical questions which are being put about his technique.
Would you like to respond, Dr. Sarosi? I know you just disagree wholeheartedly with Anthony Ozimic. If not, I would probably ask Alan Thornhill just again to maybe respond in terms of a medical perspective.
I'm sure Dr. Sarosi is aware of the risks. I'm sure he's required, in fact, in his country, as in our country, to let the patients know about all the risks. Certainly in any litigious society, you would make sure everybody knew the risks. These are risks that people are choosing. They're very motivated patients. This is not the only perhaps risky thing that they'll do in their lives to get what they want. Egg donation would be a similar situation. Surrogacy would be a similar situation. So people know what they're getting into, and they're making that choice with that full knowledge. And I'm sure that's what's happening in his clinic.
Dr. Sarosi.
Yeah, I would like to add that Mr. Anthony Ozimic mentioned ovarian hyperstimulation as the risk. Today, and maybe he's not up on this, and that's understandable, today we use a different trigger mechanism, leuprolide trigger mechanism, which I'm sure Dr. Thornhill could explain if he would like, which literally diminishes ovarian hyperstimulation to non-existent. So that's not a risk factor today in the proper hands.
I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me, Juliet Spare, on The Voice of Russia in London. From New York, Dr. Peter Sarosi from the Manhattan Fertility Clinic. Anthony Ozimic for the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children. Dr. Alan Thornhill, a leading specialist in PGD and works at the Bridge Fertility Centre in London. And Stephen Wilkinson, Professor of Bioethics at Keele University and author of a book called Choosing Tomorrow's Children.